Hi, my name's Noel Redman, and I'm going to be doing my presentation on Cindy Sherman. According to the MoMA, Cindy Sherman is widely recognized as one of the most important and influential artists in contemporary art. I think this is because she's used her photography to influence many different forms of art, and she's done so in a way that she's used social commentary to get to where she is at. And I think it's really important for artists to have more than just a pretty picture, and she does the exact opposite of that sometimes. Cindy Sherman was born on January 19th, 1954. The 66-year-old grew up in Long Island, New York. In 1972, she enrolled at the University of New York at Buffalo and began majoring in painting. Later in her academic career, she switched her major to photography. In an interview done by The Guardian, she says in her skills as photographer, quote, "I'm good at using my face as a canvas. I'll see a photograph of a character and try to copy them onto my face. I think I'm really observant in thinking how a person is put together, seeing them on the street, and noticing subtle things about them that make them who they are," end quote. Currently, she lives and works in New York. Sherman has been mostly a self-portrait photographer for 30 years. Using makeup, clothing, prosthetics, and different editing techniques, she's been able to create elaborate identities. You'll see in my later slides that she almost takes on this persona like it's herself. And I think it's important to note that every person in the photos are her, that she's not using different people. And I think sometimes the way she presents herself in these photos, it's hard to differentiate, but I think that makes her photos specifically unique. To create her photographs, Sherman became the photographer, the model, the makeup artist, and the director of the whole shoot. She uses wigs, costumes, makeups, prosthetics, and different props to alter her physical appearance and the surroundings to create a multitude of different personas ranging from housewife to clown to elite socialite. Her career began in the mid-70s, and she has been seemingly unstoppable ever since. She's created more than hundreds of photos and landed herself into many notable museums and galleries. In her work, she has strived for a certain uniqueness. She didn't want to create exact duplicates of things everyone has already seen. Specifically in her first series, she set out to photograph more of the in-between scenes of what her narrative was in relations to film and movies. She didn't set out to make movie stills or even use a strong emotion, but rather focus on the small details of those shoots and the things behind those, while making a social commentary on the way that women are viewed in these films. I think in her career accomplishments, it's important to note the locations her work has been in, the different awards she has been given, and prominent events that she's partaken in. Her work has been all over the world in locations like the Tate Gallery in London, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, also known as the MoMA, which is often identified as one of the largest and most influential museums of modern art in the world, as well as the Metropolitan Museum of Art, known as the Met, which is the largest art museum in the United States. I think noting that her work has been in some of the biggest museums and galleries, in the US and, overseas even, it just shows the impact she has made on the modern art community. Sherman has received the Hasselblad Foundation International Award in Photography in 1999, the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship in 1995, and the Premium Imperial from the Japan Art Association, as well as the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award. Sherman has participated in 4 Venice Biennales, 5 Whitney Biennales, and 2 Biennales of Sydney. These are basically surveys of arts or kind of like galleries that are only held every 2 years. She's also partaken in a documenta in 1983, which is an exhibition that occurs every 5 years. I think it's important to note these events just because these are events that happen and are curated over the course of long periods of time. And so the fact that she's been invited to these events and given these awards and her work has been located in these places just shows the impact her career has made and the world in general. Sherman said, "I'm trying to make other people recognize something of themselves rather than me." I thought it was interesting that she said this because, she's photographing herself primarily. Most or all of her work is directed and revolves around her. And some people might find that, narcissistic, but, that's not her intention. I guess in some ways. And I think it's really cool that she's like playing on these different personas to try and make people think about themselves and think about other people and the way that stereotypes and emotions and all of these things play into humanity in a way. And that she's using herself as almost like a convoy for that, I think is really unique of her. One of her more prominent works and most known works is her very first series. After she graduated from SUNY in 1976, she started working on the untitled film stills for 3 years. And it's one of her more well-known series. It's one that a lot of people know, Cindy Sherman, Untitled Film Stills. This is her series. This series is a commentary on the female roles that Sherman grew up with and those that came before her time. These photos were being taken during the rise of feminism in the 70s. So she used these photos to comment on the stereotype of women in, film and movies. Most of these stereotypes focused on, women being prudes or virgins or being wholeheartedly devoted to just serving men. She wanted to demonstrate how superficial everything appeared in the photos. In this bottom right photo, she can be seen, holding eggs or cleaning something, doing generic housework. And in most of the other photos, she looks very, clean cut, covered, dramatic, very upkept in a house, on the street, covered. It's very modest compared to what we now see, on the street. During the time that this was released and being criticized, Sherman did face some backlash with the photos. She was accused of making the photos solely for the purpose of men, and she was called out for further objectifying women in media and life. And, that wasn't even the intention of the photos to begin with. It was to commentate on the roles that women have assumed because of how men look at women and how men treat women. Despite all of the backlash and controversy that these photos faced, this series allowed her to rise to fame in the international art world. This was her big break. This was the series that gained her traction and respect in the art world. In 1996, they compiled the series as a whole and placed it on display at the MoMA, which is, a big deal. Like I said earlier, it's identified as one of the largest and most influential museums of modern art. The fact that her entire series that she released out of college landed there is quite remarkable to me. The next work I'm going to speak on is the two series, Disasters and then Fairy Tales. In these series, she uses her physical appearance to explore a fantasy world of her own creation. Sherman worked on her fairy tale series throughout the year 1985. Following that, she worked on Disasters from 1986 to 1989. In these series, she once again played on gender stereotypes, and Sherman often showed, a damsel in distress. Like in these photos, you see a woman, at least on the left side, she looks like she has a stale glaze. She's very lifeless almost. And even in the right photo, she's, not looking towards the camera. She's cold looking because of the blue light. She's almost non-responsive to the camera at all. Pulling this antiquated stereotype from film and movies, she demonstrates how art can show that our stereotypical way of thinking is taken from culture rather than it being a natural occurrence or a natural thought. While it appears as though it could be, most of, our way of thinking is pulled from media, like we gain news and, now we gain our news and our opinions from things like social media and movies and different television shows. It's not quite different from back then and these stereotypical ways of thinking. In King Kong, this group of men is trying to save this woman from a giant gorilla overtaking New York. And even in The Wizard of Oz, this young girl is trying to find home with a group of men trying to find another man to help save her and get her home. These series marked a change in Sherman's representation. She shifted the photos from being focused on how men perceive women. In these series, she focuses on how women carry that inside. From going from soft and alluring women and their lives as housewives and things have been replaced by the rotting essence of a human being. These two women that are being portrayed in these photos seem lifeless, almost in a state of depression or death because of the way they're being portrayed, and the colors in one photo they're very dull and then the other they're very cold. The next work I'm going to talk on is pulled from a series that she did on fashion. Despite her beginnings in painting and photography, has made an interesting impact on the fashion world that most people wouldn't think about. In 1983, Sherman created a fashion series containing 14 photos. They were done for Interview magazine, for an ad campaign for the clothing store Diane B. This series led her to work with companies like Balenciaga, Comme des Garçons, and Marc Jacob. Instead of photographing herself in high glamour and making herself appear beautifully like most models we see, she goes against the conventional beauty standards by making herself less appealing and wearing more eccentric and poor-fitting clothing. I think it's interesting to think about fashion in this way because when we look at advertisements or social media or whatever, fashion forward form of art, we're thinking about how beautiful the person is or how beautiful the clothing is. And here we're thinking about how eccentric it is and how unique it is. In the first photo, it's a very interesting combination of clothing that most people weren't thinking of. And she's not exactly sitting in the most flattering way or having the most flattering face, but she's portraying the clothing in a way that makes you want to stare longer. I feel like in some senses we become completely desensitized to the idea of pretty people because we see them so constantly. I think this is a way for fashion to branch out and get your attention in a different way. This year, the clothing company Undercover actually used Sherman's untitled film series that I spoke about previously for their runway show. They actually printed the photos onto clothing and wore them in the show. Undercover later released the line of clothing where they sold clothing with the photographs printed on it. These shirts and things were anywhere from 600 US dollars to 1600 US dollars. I think it's very interesting that her work specifically became such a high point in fashion that it can be sold for such a high amount of money, and that she's impacted the designer of these clothing and the fashion world in that way. I think it really shows, again, the impact of her career and her influence on other people through her work. In 2016, Sherman seemingly took a hiatus from making new work. She just kind of fell off the face of the earth. She previously had another hiatus in 2012, but came back again in 2014 making new work. Later in 2017, she made her private Instagram public. It contained many digitally manipulated images, and ever since then, they have been consistently posted in her feed, along with things she finds relevant or of her just in her personal life, with her step grandkids and things like that. Recently, she's been posting about, Black Lives Matter and things like that. I think it's really interesting for an artist to, produce art and release it in such a way, especially unintentionally with COVID going on. She's still able to stay relevant without using a gallery or a museum to stay relevant. And I also think that it's a, commentary again, like fashion was, on our traditional, what we think beauty standards are, and breaking up the traditional Instagram feed of models and what people are doing this summer, and how cute people thought they looked this week. I think it's really interesting that she's posting these less than flattering self-portraits and selfies on her Instagram. It's almost tying directly into everything she started out doing. I think it's a brilliant way to, stay relevant and continue making the work that means something. Thank you guys for listening in on my Cindy Sherman presentation. I hope that, this entices you to research her more and do a little more deeper delve into her work.